Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and I'm joined by Professor Richard Wolff. Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a new podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its politics, its economics, and its philosophy, with the hope, of course it can only be a hope, of shaping and building better alternatives to our current economic system, i.e. capitalism. With me to make sense of all of this is Professor Rick Wolff, America's most prominent Marxian economist, according to the New York Times at least, although in his infinite humility he likes to add that there ain't a lot of competition there. Professor Wolff is Emeritus Professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he taught for multiple decades and, alongside Steve Resnick, produced some of the most innovative scholarly contributions to Marxian theory. This week, the Dialectic at Work explores the following question: why Marx and why Marxian theory? Specifically, what is it about Marx and Marxism that generates so much interest generations and generations after the original work was written and published? What is it that Marx said that is interesting and useful for contemporary societies and the world revolution as a whole? With me to make sense of this is Rick Wolff. And Rick, I want to start with some questions that are going to be pertinent for us in terms of understanding your engagement with Marxism, how you became interested in Marx as a person. So I guess I want to start with a little bit about your family history, which I think is a fascinating, place to start this story. Could you say something about your parents and...
Sure. Especially now when there is so much noise about immigration, strikes me that the best way to start is to say that both my parents were immigrants. They were not born in the United States. They came here as adults, having completed their educations and begun their careers in Europe. My father in France and my mother in Germany. And they didn't leave because they wanted to. They were driven out basically by Nazism, by fascism. My father left early, sort of immediately after Hitler comes to power in the early part of 1933, and leaves Germany, goes to France. He had been a law student in Germany, had become a lawyer in Germany, and then actually become a judge in the German court system. Something that mattered after the war, because when the war was over and Germany lost, one of the results of losing a war is that you may be required to make reparations to the people who won the war, to help the people who won the war pay for the war that you lost. And my mother received a pension as the widow of a retired judge, because when my father died, he was a retired judge of Germany who died, even though he had left Germany years ago. And now, as the child of an immigrant, you are in a peculiar situation. I learned at home French and German, languages I speak to this day, because it was the first 5 years of my life. I was born in Ohio. I'm an American citizen by birth. But I had one leg, if you like, in Europe. And I have always kept up with European politics and European culture because it's really half of what I am. But for my parents, and this is where it shapes me and my interest in Marxism, my parents confronted me as a child with a reality. Mostly this was implicit, but sometimes with my father especially explicit. And the reality is trauma. My parents suffered trauma. My father's sister was arrested by the German police and killed. My mother spent time in a concentration camp. These were experiences that you wouldn't want to impose on anybody. And they traumatized my parents, who grew up in modest but comfortable circumstances in France and Germany and had never had any experience like this. And so you might say an overarching pressure on me was to understand the trauma that I felt as a child, but couldn't put into words, couldn't analyze, but knew was somehow fundamental to behaviors of my parents, to the life in my family. My sister and I both had to accommodate, for lack of a better term. And I got from my father the following sense, that his way of coping with the trauma imposed on him was to understand it. He couldn't change it. He didn't have the strength. He didn't have the power. He didn't have the movement. Social movement, which would have been necessary to deal with it that way. But as an individual, as a thinking person, he could understand it. And by understanding it, get some control, some mastery, some way to be other than the victim. And I think that shaped me more than anything else. It taught me that the way you can cope with the injustices, the outrages, traumas imposed on you is at least to try to understand why it happened. Why did this happen? And to draw out of an understanding maybe some suggestions of what you can do so it doesn't happen again. So what you can do to protect your own family and friends from this experience. In there is a way of coping which, in retrospect, I have come to understand is a lot better than resigning yourself to it, trying to internalize as if you can handle it, that level of trauma, which you can't, which will destroy you psychologically and those around you. Not that you mean to, but something has to happen to cope with this kind of trauma. And I think there's a line, and maybe we can explore it, from this notion of having to understand that I have carried with me ever since. I remember early on, for example, since we lived in a suburb of New York City and my father worked in New York City, that he would have to take the train in and out. He was a commuter. And on a rare occasion, he would take me with him, which was very exciting for me as a little boy. And the train from where we lived in a town called New Rochelle into New York City passes through Harlem in New York City. And the train is elevated there, so you look into the apartments, which are about 30 feet from where the train goes. And you can see into in their kitchens and their living rooms. And I noticed as a small child that people were poor and they were black, and I wasn't neither of those. And so I would ask my father, and then my father would get a serious look on his face and explain to me the horrible injustice of this culture in how it treats black people. And I think from the first, I then applied the lesson my father had taught me. I can't do anything. When I'm going to stop the train and go out there, what could I do? But I can understand. I want to understand why would people like you and me be treated like this, live like that, work like that. And again, there it is. I needed explanations for horror and injustice and trauma, either of my own or what I can see and touch. And Marxism, right away, even though I wouldn't have known then what that is, eventually Marxism presented itself to me as an explanation for trauma. Now the trauma of the working class, of the people who do the work and watch the wealth accrue elsewhere. And trying to understand became for me an extremely important thing.
Wow. So in this process of trying to understand the world around you, you ended up at some of the best universities in the world. You're a poster child for American higher education, Harvard, Yale, Stanford. So did they teach you anything about how to come to terms with that trauma, or teach you
Well,
Marxism or something like that?
no, they didn't teach me Marxism, but they taught me something all immigrants kind of get, whether or not they want to understand traumas or not. Every immigrant wants somehow to make the trauma, maybe here there is trauma, to make the trauma of migration. People have to remember to migrate is to leave behind your language, your culture, your religion, your family, your community. It is a wrenching experience. You don't want to do that. That is painful. That is loss. That is the things that you try in much of your life to avoid, to evade, to not have to go through. If you have to, for whatever reason, and you now go to another culture, another country, another language, you need, without ever putting it into words, to retrospectively make that be the right decision. Did I go through all of that and end up in a worse situation than you wanted to succeed? Immigrants want to be successful in the country to which they go because it's part of making it worthwhile what they went through, even if they came as young people, students, or people who didn't have a particular horrible trauma. It's still, whether they're conscious of it or not, it's a big change. And they want it to be a right decision, the way you want to look back on the big decisions of your life and hope that you made the right decision. And my parents said, we want you to do that. They didn't put in those words, but we want you to do that. And the way I understood it may or may not be what they meant. But the way I understood it was, you need to be the success we couldn't. Mm-hmm. Both my parents, my father's law career was gone. His position as a judge was gone. When I was born in this country, I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, in the middle of the country. My father worked in a steel mill with a wheelbarrow. He was a common laborer, even though he had a law degree and had been a judge in the United States. None of that was recognized. And he was grateful that he was alive, so he was okay. But that was the end of his career aspirations. My mother was a university student at the University of Berlin. Her education stopped. She ran away, lucky to be alive. So this was a frustrated student and a frustrated judge, lawyer. And I was to be the success that somehow ratified or justified all that they had gone through in their migration here to the United States. And I interpreted that as, you have to do whatever is necessary here to make it. So I played football, and I played the violin, and I got all the right grades, and then I went to Harvard. That's what it was. And I didn't know what Harvard was, and my parents didn't either. The counselor, the guidance counselor, they were called in my public high school, did all the work about applying, and so that's why I got to Harvard.
So that's an interesting contradiction. The son of immigrant parents, a middle class background, ends up with all of these elite kids. How was that experience like?
Strange. I had early in my freshman year, the way the freshman dormitories were set up at Harvard, there was an advanced student, I think a law student, who got some kind of money or free housing by living in the dorms with undergraduates and being a kind of advisor or mentor or something like that. And he called me into his office, a perfectly nice fellow, and he asked me, do you have a sport jacket? And I had to look the man in the face and say, what is a sport jacket? I had no idea. And he said and then he took out of his closet a tweedy sport jacket, showed it to me. I had seen them, so now I understood what he meant. And he told me where in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I could get one. And he advised me that I would be much better off if I had such a thing, number one. Number two, that I should arrange when I bought it I'll never forget it, for there to be leather patches sewn on the elbow of the two. And I said to him, being naive, "Oh, you mean in case it wears out?" He smiled. He said, no, it'll not wear out. It's just that'll make you fit in better. And then I would advise you every day at 5:00, we have sherry in the lounge. Harvard in those days, and perhaps still, I don't know, was very into being Harvard. The sense of self there is exaggerated beyond all words or all justification. So I didn't know what sherry was either. I learned sherry is a drink, and you drink that, and you have a leather patch on your tweed jacket. I had to learn how to do that. What I didn't have any problem with was the schoolwork. And the schoolwork was easy for me. I had been well prepared by my high school in New Rochelle, public high school. I was better prepared than a good number of the majority of students at Harvard were from private schools, Exeter, Andover, those private high schools. But I had a better preparation.
So this must have been a really interesting time at Harvard in terms of the political scene in the U.S. as a whole. Were you embroiled in any kind of political activism on campus?
No. Harvard had made a decision. They had come under some sort of criticism, and they had made a decision to make senior faculty available to young students, incoming freshmen, which they hadn't done before, and also to be more broadly democratic. They actually used words like that, which was translated into meaning actually, take people who come from modest means. Otherwise, they were then what is now called a legacy school. They mostly took children either of people who had been to Harvard before or of their friends. And it's an elite school. It still is, but they made the effort. And I was part of what came in as clearly not legacy. My parents weren't American, let alone Harvard graduates. But I played the violin and I played the football and so forth, so I could be accepted there. And I had enormous opportunities at Harvard that I'm grateful for. The education as a whole, no. As the French would say, pas grand-chose, not a big deal. But I had 2 or 3 professors that were outstanding. And there was a professor, not at Harvard, but who lived in Cambridge a few blocks from Harvard, who became my mentor, and that was crucial to me.
And who was that?
That was a German refugee, like my father, French-German. His name was Fritz Pappenheim. Wrote a famous book at the time called The Alienation of Modern Man. He was a Marxist scholar. He had worked in the agriculture ministry of the government of Spain during the time of the left wing before Franco fought the Civil War. So he had left Germany and France, where he knew my father, and gone to work for the left-wing government of Spain, and then had to flee when the Civil War was lost, came to the United States through my father, my father had left Germany and gone to France because he was bilingual and he had the joint background. And from 1933 to 39, my father functioned as a lawyer in Paris, even though legally he had no right to do that because his law degree was in Germany. But on the other hand, he was French, so he could. And his job for the law firm he worked for in Paris was to get visas for refugees running from Eastern Europe, Central Europe, to escape the Germans, the Nazis. And so when I was young, even as a young professor, I would give talks at American universities. And often I tell this story at the end of one of these talks, people would come up, and I thought they were coming up to ask questions, as some were, but others would look at me kind of furtively and say, "Was your father Max Wolff?" Which my father's name, Max Wolff. And I would say, "Yes." After a while, I became used to this. Tears would come, and they would tell me that he saved their mother, their sister, them in cases. What my father did was he organized in France a network. The French word is réseau, a network of farm and rural families where he would hide refugees who, say, came from Poland or from Czechoslovakia or from parts of Germany or wherever they came from, came through Paris, trying desperately to beat the arrival of the German army. And he would hide them because they had no papers. They had no right to be in France. He would hide them in some rural. He'd pay a farmer, take care of these people, stick them in the attic, keep them for a few weeks or months, as long as it takes me to get them a visa. And then my father jokingly would tell the story. In the evening in Paris, he would go to whichever embassy was having a cocktail party. He would go, show his credentials as a local lawyer, so they'd let him in. And then his job was to find which attaché of which embassy was looking for a little bit of money. And he would take him into a corner and he would say, in French, "How much for a visa? How much for 10 visas?" And then they would negotiate. Money would change hands. They'd agree to meet, and visas would be prepared for the clients my father had. He would then call into rural Normandy or the Pyrenees Mountains or wherever he had stuck these people, and they would then come back to Paris. And you have to remember, at that time, as the war is building up to the war, the French police could stop you on the street and demand your papers. And if you didn't have the right papers, you wouldn't go back to your apartment. They would take you arm in arm to the train station and put you back to whatever country you had come from, which for many of these people was jail. They didn't yet understand that the Germans might have worse than jail in mind for you. And by the way, that's how my father met my mother. She was a refugee. She came through Paris. She found her way to his office. They didn't know each other. And he hid her in a little village in the south of France, where she spent many months until he got the visa for her to come back to Paris. And then, because he only had a visa, he didn't get a visa. He got her a work permit. She left the south of France, came back to Paris, now had the legal right to be in Paris. And if stopped by a cop, she had the papers to show that she could be there. But she wanted to get out too. Her problem was he didn't manage that for her fast enough before the Germans came. And so she had to flee back to the south of France to go into a French concentration camp. People don't understand there were German camps and there were French camps. Very bad to be in a German camp, much less bad to be not good, but not. My mother was in a French one about a year before my father, who had left for the United States, got the paperwork done in the United States to get her out of the camp to New York. I mean, but you see, the trauma's there because I can't summarize for you, waiting to see if you'd ever get out of the camp, whether you'd make it alive. People were dying around you, whether the man you hoped, they weren't married yet, was your boyfriend in New York, would do. The uncertainty drives people crazy. My mother can tell stories. I mean, she's dead now, but she could tell stories, and she did tell stories about people around her who literally went insane. They could not handle the layers of trauma. I try to explain to people, whatever your point of view, for example, on Gaza and Israel right now, what those people in Gaza are going through, the least of it is the bomb that wrecks your house. I mean, that's terrible. But the injury, the anxiety about the injury, the anxiety about the death that may or may not happen to it, you put people under a pressure like that, you produce damage that lasts generations.
It's fascinating that, you talk about this, because I was listening to Heinz Kohut, this German psychiatrist, the other day, and someone asked him the question, why is it the case that so many people who produced some of the best works in psychoanalysis and Freudian theory, for example, had some link with, some relationship, either themselves or their parents had some relationship with these concentration camps and that trauma. So would you say that somewhat in the same vein as people became interested in Freudian theory or psychoanalysis as a way of coming to terms with that trauma, would you say that in your case, Marxism, and you also are interested in Freudian theory, I believe,
Yes.
would you say that your interest in Marxian theory is partially linked with trying to come to terms with the experiences that your parents narrated to you?
Absolutely. And I think that I've always thought that. I think that the desire to understand how human beings could possibly do such things to one another makes you ask questions about psychological development, but likewise about social development. My father and mother were crystal clear. They didn't blame what happened to them on this or that individual or this or that individual consciousness. If anything, they could have and should have asked more about that, in my opinion. My father and mother made clear that this was a social phenomenon. Let me give you an example of what that implies. I was never taught to hate Germany or German, not at all. I mean, for me, the great music as I was growing up was Beethoven, Brahms, Bach, the great German musicians. I was taught to read at an early age Hegel and Immanuel Kant and great German tradition. My parents were proud of this. My father, with French, talked to me about the great tradition of Jean Jaurès, a crucial figure in French socialism and the history. So my father, they was interested in the social causes of what happened to him. I was interested in exactly the point you made. I was interested in that, but I was also interested in how does an individual do that? I'm married to a psychotherapist. My daughter is a psychotherapist. So hint, this is an important issue. And I knew it. And I knew that my family, my mother and father were afraid of it. So we never had therapy or anything. And whenever that came up, it would be dealt with humor, with dismissive humor. But, by the time I'm an adult, I have figured out that this is an evasion. And I want to then replicate. And I married somebody, I think in part, we always wonder, why did we marry whoever we married? But in part, I wanted to have close in somebody who asks those questions, who answers those questions. And I have learned a mountain from both my wife and my daughter about that material. And so I think, yes, it's the same impulse.
So at what point did you seriously, very, very seriously decide that I got to study Marxism as there's something interesting here? Obviously, because your background from Europe has something to do with it. You knew more about the stuff than the average American, I'm assuming, at the time. So what really got you into studying this as a discipline?
My father was the intellectual of the house. That was partly the usual gender divisions, but also that my mother's education in the university was cut short, and she never finished. My father did, and graduated in law school. And in Europe, it's more what we would here call jurisprudence, not so much the practicality of law. I mean, he did that, but it was the philosophy of law. My father was aghast at the quality of public education that his son and daughter were receiving. I like to tell the story early on when I arrived in the New Rochelle Public High School. Within the first week, we were sitting around the dinner table, and my father said, "Well, what courses are you taking?" And I told him. And he said, "Well, when do you have Latin and when do you have Greek?" And I looked at my father and I said, "They don't do Latin and Greek." And my father looked at me as if I was telling some sort of lie. And being my father, he was strong-willed. He came into the school the next day and wanted to see the principal. He was very polite and nice. He said, "My son tells me," and the principal corroborated, "Yes, And my father said, "How's that possible?" And my father related when he went to gymnasium in Germany. You study Greek and Latin because that's where it all starts in Western culture. The principal, very nicely, because I'm in the room, embarrassed, of course. I'm in the room, and he says, "We've never taught Greek. I mean, we have nobody teaches. I mean, that's out. But if you can get a few other parents to say they want Latin, we can get a teacher to teach Latin," which my father did. And so I learned Latin in high school. I had 2 years of Latin. And that was my substitute. I didn't need French and German. I already spoke that, and the teachers knew that. So I learned Latin. My father thought the education system here was very, very underdeveloped. I'll be as polite as I could. So he supplemented it. So I remember when I was about 16, he said to me, apropos some conversation, "I want to give you something to read." Now, I didn't get all that much attention from my father, and what I got I treasured. And so if he was interested in something, I was very interested in that too, but not so much because of the subject, but because of the rapport that would then exist. So he gave me the dialogues of Plato, those short little pieces. And I loved it. I could understand it. I remember coming down one day for breakfast, and I stayed up late reading Plato's explanation, The Proof for the Existence of God. And I came down and I announced to my parents that I was now persuaded that there was God. And I knew enough to know that that was not part of our household. We didn't visit any institution, not on Sunday or Saturday or Friday, ever. And that my parents had no interest in or knowledge of that. So I knew this would be a little bit provocative, and it was. But I say it only because my father gave me a range of things. And among the things he gave me were Marx. And he explained to me, because my father was not a Marxist, really, he wasn't. He explained to me that there are these great thinkers, and that one of the ways I should develop myself would be to read them, because they are teachers, and because of he said, they were people who, for some reason, at the moment they lived, lots of things came together. He didn't have the concept of overdetermination yet. That comes later. But they are just if it hadn't been them, it would have been someone else. But they were at that moment when you could think about and see something, and they wrote it. They knew how to write, and so they're the greatest teachers you could possibly find. Read them. And so I got, my father gave me what he had in his library, and I read Plato, and I remember a little bit of St. Augustine in the Catholic Church, Hegel. That I found that much harder. It is hard, but that was harder. And
you were reading these in the German, I believe.
Some in the German, but mostly in English, because I had the wrong idea that I could take this that I was learning and use it in school. I quickly realized that I was already looked upon as the nerdy, brainy kid, and if I quoted Plato, that would kill it. So I didn't do that. So I bifurcated. But I was also on the football team and the orchestra, and I wanted, like all teenagers, I wanted to have a group of people who liked me. We did things together. I did not want to create differences beyond what already existed. And Marx was then presented by my father as one of those people that you have to read. He didn't use it, but I'm going to say it in the American idiom. If you want to be an educated person, you have to read this. It's not going to happen by itself. You need to. Will you be a nice person without it? Sure. Can you do jobs without that? Yes. But the whole quality of your life and the quality of the work you do will be enhanced if you think about these people who are some of the greatest. And Marx was simply there. To have excluded Marx would have struck my father as odd and weird. Now, he wasn't stupid. He knew there was a Cold War, and by that time we were in the 1950s, and it was getting really scary. So, I remember the moment when my father explained to me that the Marx we were reading together was something I should not talk about in school. He had not said that to me before. The decision not to talk about Plato, that was my own. The decision not to talk about Marx probably would have been mine too, but my father added an explanation. And so, I learned early on. And to be honest, I suspect that probably made me more interested. You must not have the cookies.
There's something naughty about it.
That's right. Naughty and not supposed to. And I'm really interested. I want to go there. But I didn't start really reading Marx until I was at Harvard in college. It was then that it went from part of the story to the focus. And that was more the work of Fritz Pappenheim, this German professor, sociologist, who married a very wealthy woman here in the United States, and so retired relatively early, and felt a debt to my father. My father had helped him escape. I think my father helped him escape out of Spain into France, and then out of France to the United States. And his first job was at Talladega, the black college in the South. And he taught there for a few years until McCarthyism. They fired him. But by that time, he was married to this very wealthy woman. So they lived in Cambridge. And he knocked on my door when I was a freshman at Harvard. And I had never met him. And explained who he was. My father had told me a little bit about him. And he said, I want to pay your father back. He saved my life. And I said, well, by that time I'd had this experience a few times. And I was nice and polite, but I had no idea what he was talking about. And so he asked me a question. Are you interested in Marxism? I don't remember, but I remember the question. I don't remember my answer, but I probably said yes, because it would have been true. I wouldn't have been interested in those days more in Marxism than in a dozen other thinkers. But he said, well, I'll make you a proposition. I live, and it was 4 blocks from the Harvard where I lived. You come to my house once a week or once every other week. We'll have a really nice dinner. My wife, Yvonne, is a great cook, which she was. And we'll have wine with the dinner. That got my interest even more, because Harvard did not serve wine. And that's what I did. For the 4 years of my undergraduate at Harvard, I had, in effect, a 4-year tutorial from Fritz Pappenheim, meeting him every week or two for dinner, just as he had said. And he said, I'm going to take you through the classics of Marxism, which we did. The pamphlets, the books, Capital, Theories of Surplus Value, even what's now called the Grundrisse that comes earlier. Some of it in German we did because he's a German speaker, so was I. And
so just to be clear, this is stuff that you're learning elsewhere, not in Harvard, right?
That's right. I'm at Harvard, but I'm off the campus learning this.
This is not part of the curriculum.
No. In fact, what would happen is I'd be taking courses at Harvard, and there'd be a term paper to write. And here's what I would always do. I would go, and next time I see Fritz, I say, Fritz, here's the term paper. And the topic is, I don't know, Civil War in Germany or whatever it was. And what Fritz would do is say, well, here are the books and articles with a Marxian interpretation of this. See what you think. I loved this. Because not only did I learned, because they were all critics, they all criticized the traditional explanation for the French Revolution, or, French Revolution I was taught, by this American scholar. Then they would give me, I remember them, Mathieu and Hollard, the great French specialists. Hollard, if I remember, was the non-Marxist, Mathieu was the Marxist, or vice versa. And I was given this wonderful introduction to what's wrong with the conventional story and what is missing. And this was exciting to me. And I think I just picked up the Marxism by learning that this was feeding. I was now able to explain things I had knew about, but never had understood before. And it was historical. So I was learning how to think in a Marxists are always interested in the history. They're interested in how it develops, there's my father again. Where did Nazism come from? Why were the Germans devotees of it? And these questions were being answered with this Marxian literature in a much more satisfying way than anything else. And I wasn't predetermined to go there. It wasn't a matter of loyalty to my father. My father wasn't a Marxist. He wasn't against it, but he wasn't an advocate. Fritz was more of an advocate. But Fritz was also very much, he studied lots of non-Marxists. There's a German sociology tradition that comes out of a man named Ferdinand Tönnies, Tonnies. And if you had to give a label to Fritz, he was a follower of Tönnies and Marx. But even there these were not thinkers who were narrow. They were not dogmatic. They found in Marxism enormously valuable insights, and the idea of not working with them struck them as, that's ridiculous. It's like insisting that the only way to make a fire is to rub sticks. Wait a minute, there's these people have invented a lighter. Try that. It goes faster, Think about it.
So your interest in economics, how did that come about? Was economics something that you thought would be interesting in explaining the world to you, or what was it?
At first, no. I think at first when I went to Harvard as an undergraduate, I had been studying in high school science. And if you had asked me as a freshman, they did ask me, I wanted to become a biochemist. God knows why, but that's what I said. And my first semesters at Harvard were biology, chemistry, mathematics, physics, all of that. What you do if you're going to go into the natural sciences. And if people have asked me all my life, why didn't you stay there? My mother, more than my father, told me to do this. And her rationale was obvious, and she was explicit. She was noticing that already in high school, I was heading over to the left politically. She picked that up. I had some of that in me, but not much, some. But it frightened her. Remember, these are people traumatized by fascism. So for my mother, she was very nervous that if I kept going in this lefty direction, I'd get into trouble. And I remember her saying to me, "You work in a laboratory with a Bunsen burner. No one gives a damn what you think. Just be a scientist, go in the lab." To be safe. It was an igloo that would keep her warm in the winter. I did what my mother and father wanted me to do. So I did it. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand doing these experiments and then laboriously writing them up in the way that they wanted to. And I liked the mathematics. I've always found that interesting. But the rest of it, no. And so I had a cathartic moment with my parents at the end of the first year. I said, "I can't do this." And they were disappointed. And they said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I did go to visit a friend of my father's who was a professor at Harvard. My father gave me a letter written in German to give to this professor, who was also a German refugee. He was a theologian named Paul Tillich, quite well known as a Protestant theologian. He was a professor of theology at Harvard, but a friend of my father's. And I went, presented the letter to him, and he allowed me to take his class. And we met occasionally. We talked German. He had been in Germany head of the Student Christian Socialist Organization of Students. And in that capacity had organized conferences and demonstrations with the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which was also socialist, but not Christian. They were not, religious. So he knew my father as the head of that thing, and my father knew him as the head of the Christian side. They worked together. My father was in the Social Democratic Party. Again, not a Marxist, but a leftist, left of
broadly
center.
defined.
Yeah. And they liked each other and they remembered each other. And he felt kindly to me. And he was a great lecturer. He was by far the best lecturer I'd ever seen or heard. I mean, his classes were unbelievable at Harvard. You had a room of 500 students, and they were hanging off the windows to listen to him. He was just spectacular. And so for me at Harvard, I answered my parents' question. I can't stay with the biochemistry, the science. I want to do philosophy. Because that was really what I was getting from Tillich. It was Christian, yes, but this was a very secular, deeply, everything was Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, the great four geniuses of German philosophy. And I loved this. I just drank it up. By the way, Karl Marx comes out of that tradition. Those were his teachers. That wasn't relevant to me then, but thinking later, without meaning to, I'm drawn into that. And Tillich, as a Christian socialist, he was safe. He was a Christian. No one's going to bother him. So he could talk about Marx openly in his classes and did so. Most of my other teachers were afraid to do anything like that. Anyway, I want to do philosophy, and my parents started to cry. Who hires a philosopher? What do you need?
That's similar to Marx's parents as well, I was going to say.
That, philosophy. So we made a compromise, economics. So then I went back, I took an economics course. I got the worst grade in the economics course I ever got in undergraduate school. I couldn't believe what this was. I went into I want to understand the economy and how it shapes the society and the contradictions. I already knew the language. I knew what I wanted to. Instead, I was watching these anemic equations. I remember the beginning, there's this curve, the indifference curve, this nonsensical junk that had nothing to do with why I was there, or for that matter, with most of the other students who had also come in wanting to understand how the economy works, not this junk. What is this junk? So I went home to my parents and said, this is impossible. So we made another compromise. history. I majored in history at Harvard. That's what I did, European history. And in that way, I could access my parents' life. What explains what happened to my parents? This is a real reason I went there. And plus, I had an advantage. I could read French and German, so I could get into it. I had much more passion than any of the other students because I had much more going on as to what I did. And again, of course, I would encounter Marx because modern European history is full of Marx. The 19th and 20th century are Marx is growing, Marxism is growing. And without me understanding it, I was groping my way, the way a lot of students do, towards what I wanted to study. And so I could go to Fritz and I could say, whether it was Russian history or British history or whatever it was, modern Europe, and Fritz knew, because it's his field, what to give me. And in the course of it, I was introduced to one Marxist theorist after another. And I was enthralled. Even the ones that weren't Marxists, but were the ones who, even though they didn't know it, were using Marxist theory. One of the ones I loved, a British historian named R.H. Tawney, wrote a book called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Max Weber is most well known for that work, or the American Talcott Parsons, but it's really Tawney who has the best on this. And what it was is it showed me how religion itself is a product of capital in its modern forms, how it was inherited from feudalism, but it was appropriate to feudalism, had to be reorganized completely, top to bottom, which is what happened. And Tawney, with the ironic British sense of humor, tells this story. And it is wonderful. I mean, I would sometimes laugh in the library at the genius way this man had. And all of that came from Fritz Pappenheim. So he would not only give me the Marxists, but also the others, not particularly Marxist, but whose work showed you why the Marxist approach was the way to go. So I was, over time, persuaded that, ironically, I had to learn Marxism, that I had a good beginning with the tutorial Fritz Pappenheim gave me. I loved the history, but the more I studied history, the more I understood the economics. That's what was missing in good courses, interesting courses, but the economics of it. The professors either didn't know it or were afraid to go there. And by the way, all through my education, I had countless experiences of raising my hand, asking a question, and watching the professor either let me know verbally or with his or her eyes, well, very few his eyes, either I don't know what you're talking about, or I do know what you're talking about. Please stop asking me such questions, almost pleading, so that I would go sometimes when I got that pleading to their office, and then I would hear, if I talk to you about that, then you will talk over lunch to your roommate, and I'll begin to get a reputation that I'm the one to go to if you're interested in Marx. I can't have that. That's the end of my career. I'm married. I have 2 children. And I learned what the Cold War.
So there's this environment of fear all around you in the academic world. But yet, too, really
often hidden, by the way, there's a footnote. The fear was often hidden by hostility. What do you mean, Marxism? And then with one sentence, something I knew had taken, generations of brilliant scholars to work out. This jackass was dismissing, that only revealed him. It didn't tell me anything about Marxism. And I had a lot. Those who were afraid often hid it with dismissal.
So 2 of the most prominent American Marxists at the time were Sweezy and Baran, Paul Sweezy and Paul Baran. And how did your how did you end up meeting them? What was your interaction with them? And did you feel that they helped you fill that gap in your knowledge of economics?
Yeah. When I was already in high school and I began to be interested in things leftist, my father, noticing that because we talked, informed me that a friend of his, a man named Harry Magdoff, who later worked with Sweezy on the Monthly Review, that he had a friend, Harry Magdoff, who he learned had groups of high school students that would come to his house in New York City every month or so for discussions. And that Harry would lead, an adult Harry, would lead these discussions among the high school students. Would I be interested in going? Harry thought I would find it interesting, given that I was now into such things. And they talked about racism, and they talked about nuclear war, and they talked about the Soviet Union. And again, it was not dogmatic, it was not, it was not rigid, but I had no such opportunity in my high school. Nobody dared talk about such topics, and certainly not in this sort of sympathetic way, let's call it. So I started going to those. And I hit it off with Harry Magdo. There were a group, I would say 20 of them. I don't mention some of their names because they became famous later in other ways, some of these people. But anyway, I hit it off with Harry. And so Harry was at that time friendly with Paul Sweezy and Baran. He wasn't yet working with them. It turns out that Sweezy lived in the town Larchmont, right next to New Rochelle, where my parents lived, and that they had crisscrossed in people's homes. They had dinner together or something. Long story short, I met Sweezy, and they were then running the Monthly Review magazine, and they were trying to keep Marxism alive in the United States during the worst period of the Cold War, the 50s and the 60s. And that was a very hard thing for them to do. Sweezy had been a professor at Harvard and had gotten fired. He was the prize student of the then leading economics intellectual at Harvard, a man named Joseph Schumpeter. So when Schumpeter retired, it was supposed to go to Sweezy. But by that time, the Cold War made that impossible. Sweezy, who comes out of the Rockefeller family, has every credential imaginable, just the kind of person Harvard usually chooses, but they fired him instead. So he went to New York and founded a magazine, the Monthly Review, 1949. And some of the money that they got to start the magazine came from Albert Einstein, who wanted to support this. People don't know that about Einstein, but it's one of the things you learn if you circulate in there. But I didn't have much to do with them. But by the time I was finished with my major in history at Harvard, I knew I had to study economics. I had to. That was what was missing in all of my training. I either was going to be a lawyer, like my father. I thought about it. I took the law school aptitude tests to do that. But I really wanted to understand. I was my father's son, more for the understanding than for the law. So I didn't go to law school. I decided to go to graduate school. Now the question was, where can I learn Marxism? And the answer was no place in the United States at that time. There was no place. What was there? A handful of individual professors who in some mysterious way had survived the Cold War. They hadn't gotten fired. Maybe they got tenure before they got fired, so they couldn't be, could be fired. So the result is that they suggested to me that I go study with Paul Baran. I didn't know him. Paul Baran was a professor at Stanford. He had tenure, which is why they couldn't fire him. They discriminated against him in hair-raising ways, which I learned later. So I went to Stanford. Stanford took me right away because I was a graduate of Harvard. Once you're in that system, and I was a good student, so I got a, what do you call it, magna cum laude at Harvard, which is not the highest, that's summa cum laude, but the next highest. And there weren't very many of us. So I was a prize student, and so Stanford took me, gave me a fellowship, a Hoover Fellowship named after Herbert Hoover, who was still alive at that time. I got a Hoover Fellowship to go to Stanford. I had no money. My parents had no money. I had no money. And Paul Baran was to be my teacher. And he loved it because he didn't have many students were afraid to go study with him. Other professors said, be careful. By the way, later in my life, for example, at UMass, I've encountered this all my life in the American Academy. My colleagues, often kind of behind my back, advising graduate students not to work with people like me because it'll be harder to get a job, which, has not been true, is not true, but is a nasty thing to do, that aside. But I learned an enormous amount because I was the only student Baran had, and so I got all his time. Unfortunately, he didn't live very long, but that's how I got part of what I had to do. And when I left, he died. I had a heart attack in March. I arrived in September. So I had 6 months of Paul Baran, but very intense. I got a lot of his time. I did a little bit of work on the book he and Sweezy were then writing called Monopoly Capital. Came out later. He gave me little assignments of research to do. But he gave me his time, and taught a great class. The rest of the people at Stanford were nothing. But I got a master's degree, and that was the end of my time at Stanford. And then I had to go find where to finish, because without Baran, when he died, I had no reason to stay there.
Mm-hmm. So Baran and Sweezy really got you interested in a particular
version. They really
version
took me another step. That's right.
Mm-hmm.